Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started. We want to welcome everybody for joining us for this presentation tonight. My name is Falika Ahastin Bryant. I'm the director of the Native American Educational and Culture Center at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. And I am also co-PI for the Purdue Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Program. And to begin with, we're very pleased to offer this speaker series. We have been hosting the speaker series for the spring and for the fall semester. It's a way for us to showcase our amazing Native Indigenous graduate students that are part of the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Program. And so to begin with, I have a very short presentation I'm going to share just to give you a little background into the Sloan program. And let me come back over here, share screen. And so we want to make sure everybody's aware of the amazing program we have here at Purdue, or actually not only at Purdue, but across all our Sloan institutions. So to begin with, as our formal introduction, I always like to start off by doing a formal land acknowledgement as a way to honor and to show our appreciation for the Indigenous caretakers that are part of our amazing land that we stand upon. Purdue University is on the indigenous homeland of the Potawatomi, the Lenape, the Miami, and the Shawnee people. And if you would like to also, I always encourage students, participants to add your land acknowledgement. I mean, add to the place where you're home, where you're at right now, as a way to show your representation. But I also think it's very important for me as a Navajo woman growing up in New Mexico. We were always on indigenous lands, but now that I'm here in Indiana, it's a way for us to do a meaningful reflection, to look back and to see who were the original people here? Are there footprints still being left here? We do acknowledge that due to forced removal that many of the tribal nations are no longer here, and we want to, taking a look to see how we can continue to honor their memories and how we can continue on with their whole concept of being stewards of the land and making sure that they're taking care of the land and preparing it for the next generation. So with that, with our Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Program, it is part of a national organization, as I mentioned. We receive funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to offer financial and academic support for Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students. We offer a number of program benefits, including funding, research opportunities, and professional development opportunities. With our Native program, our Sloan program, eligibility includes being part of an indigenous community, whether that be Native American, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and students have to pursue a master's or PhD in a STEM discipline. This is specifically for the Purdue program. Admission is basically, you have to get admitted to one of the STEM programs, and at that point, it is a second step process in terms of applying for the Sloan program. We, again, mentioned that we are part of a national organization. We have 9 institutions that represent the National Sloan Program. Some of our highlights include campus-wide program. For the Purdue program, we have over 13 Sloan scholars that are currently enrolled, and we have produced over 45, it may be a bit more than that, since 2020. And in March of last year, we were very fortunate to receive funding to have our grant renewed for the whole national organization. So what we really are impressed and we'd like to showcase is our amazing retention rate in terms of making sure that we're supporting students to get them through their academic program. Being that this is part of a national organization, I do want to just kind of pause here for just a minute to show how diverse and how widespread all the Sloan programs are, ranging from Alaska all the way out to New York. And these are the institutions that are part of our Sloan program, our Sloan family, including the University of Alaska at Anchorage, University of Alaska Fairbanks campus, University of Arizona, Montana State, Montana Tech, University of Montana, Purdue University, UNC Asheville, and the SUNY ESF program. And so with that, I can bring this back up a little bit later, or if there's an interest as prospective scholars that are, if you're looking to join our Sloan program, feel free to either contact our representatives here, or you may send us a direct message and then we can share that. Oh, thank you, Kevin. We have 49 degrees that have been at Purdue, close to 250 alumni for the national program. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to do my introduction. Oops, share. Let me see, come back here and stop sharing. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Richelle Thomas. She is currently a graduate student and a PhD student in environmental sciences at the University of Arizona in Tucson. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Northern Arizona and Flagstaff, Arizona. And I did also want to highlight and congratulate her again. She was recently selected as a Cobell for the Cobell Summer Fellowship today. So congratulations, snaps to you on that. And I will officially turn it over to you, Richelle.
All right, great. Do you have the sharing capability?
I think I got, oh, I'm sorry. I think I thought stopped it there. There you go. Multiple participants. Okay, you should be able to share now.
Hi, everybody. My name is Richelle Thomas. I'm a PhD student at the University of Arizona, and today I'll be sharing my presentation, which is a big part of my dissertation work that I've been working on and continue to work on behalf of Indigenous people, also the Diné people, and it's titled Medicinal Plants Need Protection, Heavy Metalloid Contamination in Medicinal Plants, Implications for Public Health of Indigenous People. So before I get started, usually as is customary in Navajo, we like to introduce ourselves to develop kinship amongst our relatives, you know, not just here in the Four Corners area, but throughout the United States and throughout the world. That's how we identify ourselves with each other, and also how we identify ourselves with the environment. So I'm saying that, yeah, Richelle Thomas Inishia. And my maternal family is from Colmy Mesa, Arizona, and my paternal family is from Indian Wells, Arizona. I'd also like to acknowledge the different individuals who are integral to the research that I do on a daily basis, but who are also integral to my personal development as an up-and-coming Indigenous scientist here. First, my advisor, Dr. Jim McLean, and Dr. Robert Root, who are both co-advising me, Dr. Martha Hawes, Dr. Ursula Schuch, Dr. Kalanga Rivera, Dr. Kelly Reynolds, Dr. Elishka Babs-Kosteka, and also, most importantly, the Diné Hatauqui Association on Navajo Nation, who are comprised of both medicine men and women throughout Diné PKR, throughout Diné lands, who are very much acknowledge this research as being very important to them as a grassroots and nonprofit organization on Navajo, and also to the different Navajo Nation communities that I will be working with. So before I really get started here, everybody always asks, like, I guess as a student, you know, a PhD student, my circumstances were a little different than most other scholars, in that I entered my research project having already predefined exactly what I needed and what I wanted as an Indigenous researcher. So the project that I have was actually a project that I developed from the ground up when I started my PhD program, and it's a really big, important piece of how I personally identify myself as a Navajo and woman, as a Navajo person, and just even as a human being. So like a lot of the work that I do has to do with medicinal plants that are primarily utilized by the Diné community, but that are also utilized by different Indigenous communities throughout the United States and also throughout the world. And everyone always asks, how did you get into like research? And I always have to give this backstory for people to really understand how much meaning this project brings to me, and why I'm always happy to do the work that I do every day. And I don't even consider it work at this point. It's really become a piece of an extension of who I am since I was little. So when I was about 7 years old, about 7, maybe 6 years old, I used to follow my maternal grandfather, who we call our Che, and he was a medicine man when he was here on this earth. And so when I was little, I really was immersed, and I'm still immersed in my culture and the traditional ways of knowing, being a Navajo person. And so one of the things that I do and I still practice today is really the ceremonial customs of, you know, being like a herbalist and, you know, doing different ceremonial things. So when I was little, 7 years old, my grandpa, he would take my sister and I out into these like really beautiful places. And now to think about it, I guess you would consider them sacred sites in the more like federal context of things. And we used to, you know, jump into like reservoirs and gather these plants and these different medicine that he would use for his patients. And we would also go into like the canyons and, you know, hike them to get to these different plants that would not exist anywhere else if you had looked. And, you know, hiking mountains to get spring water, hiking mountains to even get like other sorts of plants that we would use for our winter ceremonies. And we even been in blizzards and blizzard conditions and whatnot to get a lot of this stuff. So from the age of 7 is really when I really define when I really became a researcher. But I did not understand at that moment really what it meant in terms of like, you know, being like a herbalist and ethnobotany and understanding a lot of what we were doing was culturally based. It's just something I grew up knowing. And so my grandpa too, at the same time, even though he was a non-English speaking Navajo, you know, he had a lot of traditional knowledge and what we would call now in like university settings would be like traditional ecological knowledge. And so a lot of the issues here in Arizona and throughout in different indigenous communities he really advocated for were indigenous environmental rights and even human rights. And if a lot of you are familiar with like the San Francisco Peak snowballs controversy, he was also one of the plaintiffs on that specific environmental issue that was happening and is still happening up in northern Arizona. He did a lot of advocacy with Ninth Circuit Court, with United Nations in New York City and Geneva, Switzerland. So I really grew up a lot understanding not just the scientific and the TEK aspects, but I also was very much exposed to the political and the political systems of indigenous issues and whatnot. So it really became a big part of me. And I like to think that, you know, I'm following and, you know, being guided by a lot of his teachings and also his advocacy work. When I was doing my master's degree, he had passed on in my second semester. And this is really where my project really became developed at that time, was before he had gone and passed on, he had asked of me to really be very protective of indigenous communities and also to honor a lot of what he had taught and what he had stood for. And so I really took that to heart. And one of the things I had asked him is, well, you know, I want to study uranium at the time. And I really was just at this weird transition of trying to figure out how to do that, was specifically something that would be beneficial to Native communities. And so one of the things when we were talking was, well, you know, what about we study like medicinal plants? Because one of the questions he had at the time was how they could potentially be impacting his overall health as a person using these medicines over a long duration of time. And so once he passed on, I really focused on this project, not just for my master's work, but it now transitioned into my PhD work, but in a broader context now that it could have the potential to help other indigenous communities, just not Dene. So one of the things that I really identify and stand with is really my mission statement that I developed on behalf of him, was to protect, to preserve, and to honor indigenous environments and people. So in saying that, I just wanted to share that brief piece about me and why this project is very much, I take it to heart, and I do everything I can, and I do my best with what I have. So as we know, the Navajo Nation and other different indigenous communities, we have all been negatively impacted by different forms of environmental contamination, and this even includes colonial mining. And for Navajo Nation, that extends both into uranium mining and coal mining. Right now, uranium mining, they have about over 500 known abandoned uranium mines on Navajo Nation and a 44,000 acre coal bed that extends throughout the Navajo Nation and that have directly impacted not only the environment, but studies have also shown that has impacted animals, and now we're looking at the impacts to humans. The project that I'm doing now is very unique in that nobody has studied medicinal plants as it relates to heavy metal contamination and colonial mining practices, not just on the Dene Nation, but also in different indigenous communities. And it's very important work that I feel would be very beneficial, not just to the public, but also to, I had mentioned earlier, the Dene Hatauhli, the practitioners who use these medicines on a daily and consistent, and they're chronically exposed to different forms of plants. So this is also important in order to not just protect the people, but it's also important to protect culture, because without medicinal plants, they're very integral to our cultural system. They're very integral to the different cultural practices, and also even just to the daily practices of what we also call a smudging. And as I had mentioned, mining is a really big issue on Navajo Nation, and it goes all the way back to historical times in the 1940s and 60s, and is still persistent today, but is not really well known, I guess you would say, in more of the media. So like I had mentioned, my objectives for this project is to quantify not only analytically, but also to really get a visual representation of the heavy metal interaction in medicinal plants that are utilized. So being able to understand not just the biological mechanisms, but also being able to understand the chemical mechanisms that are happening not only above ground, but below ground as well. And to kind of give a bigger idea of kind of what I'm doing here, I always like to present this very diagram to people who are not really scientifically inclined, and it helps them a lot to understand exactly what I'm doing. So what I'm doing is I'm taking soil and I'm exposing it to different concentrations of heavy metals. So in my case right now, the two primary heavy metals that I work with are uranium and arsenic. And from there, looking at the plant above and below ground systems. And then from there, how does the plant directly impact the person, the different plant parts? So to do that and to achieve the objectives that I have for the study, we really want to have a controlled environment that we can account for different factors, external and internal. And so by doing that, we're able to use greenhouse studies where we can take like varying concentrations of arsenic and uranium and put it in the soil, and then figure out, how to quantify this using, mass spectrometry, X-ray fluorescent analytical techniques, but also using biological techniques to get that visual representation of plant defense mechanisms through border cell work that helps to look at detoxification of heavy metals in plants, specifically in the below ground system, the rhizosphere. But I feel, in science, we are really concerned a lot about numbers and data and values. And that's really I feel that's really the big goal, is to just get a number. But when we're working and talking about Indigenous communities, a number represents a person. A number represents somebody's home, somebody's land, somebody's animal, somebody's sister, brother. And so that's how I really like to think about it. And in doing that, I feel like, well, we can't just stop at the science now, because we're not only challenging a very sensitive topic, we're challenging a belief system, we're challenging cultural teaching that we want to preserve, that we want to protect public health too. And so to do that, we also need to have something to help mitigate a lot of that through, policy, through risk assessments. In this case, would be public health risk assessment for more the westernized context of public health. But in this case, because we're talking about culture, now we have to be able to create something from science that can be implemented into a cultural risk assessment is what I like to call it. And that's really important because, like I had mentioned, this project really does impact our traditional practitioners, and they need something to stand on if we're going to advocate for their health and the public health also of the different Indigenous communities. So that's also what I'll be working on, is doing the two different marrying of the westernized public health risk assessment and also creating cultural-based risk assessment, not just for Navajo, but that can also be transferable to other Indigenous communities, because we do share similar histories of legacy mining, but we also share similar uses of medicinal plants. So we're all directly impacted in some form. And then the other thing that I am developing with this project is medicinal usage safety guidelines is what I call it. So being able to get those numbers, put a value to it, and then being able to kind of like create a book almost for these communities, not for the scientific community, but for these communities to use and to, you know, be able to reference every day that would make sense to them. Okay, and so two of the plants that I work with right now are sage, which you guys are probably very familiar with, and also what we call Navajo tea in Navajo. But Navajo tea is not just restricted to Navajo, but it's also heavily utilized by our other neighbors in our Indigenous communities, such as Hopi and whatnot throughout Arizona. And as you guys all know, sage is heavily used by different Indigenous communities as well. I have two controls right now to account for those two specific plants that I'll be working with. We're actually working on extending that medicinal plant usage to other species as well right now, but I'm trying to figure out a lot of the controls because plants are very difficult to work with. You know, we can talk a lot about fire remediation, but plants have their own defense mechanisms, and each plant is unique based on species. So one plant might be able to, you know, fire remediate one area with uranium, but it might not be able to fire remediate with arsenic, or maybe another plant doesn't. And so we have to really take that into consideration. So one of the things to do that is to identify other plants that we know how they react to certain metals and be able to compare that as a control, and then compare it to this sample plant as well. And so it takes a little bit of literature review to do that. And for this particular project, because these plants, like I had mentioned earlier, they're not studied, they've never been studied in this way, it was really difficult to establish that guidance and that guideline to kind of go by. So I was able to find two different control plants that have been studied using these two primary metals, uranium and arsenic, so that I can do comparison as well. And like I had said, we'll also be using the biological techniques, and those techniques are not really heavily utilized too in different scientific communities. It's really it's a really unique way of approaching things. And so I'm really excited for this project, and I'm hoping, you know, in the next 5, maybe 6 years after I get the scientific portion and also a lot of the risk assessment, that I'll be able to develop a policy for the Navajo Nation Council to be able to adopt into our Navajo communities, but that can also be used as a blueprint in other Indigenous communities as well. So in saying that, I think that's the end of my presentation. I'd also like to show pictures of my the people who are part of the team that I lead here at the University of Arizona. Like I had mentioned, Dr. G. McLean and Dr. Robert Root are both co-advising me, and then Dr. Gilberto Colongo Rivera, he works in Mexico. I met him here when he was working here at the University of Arizona through Dr. Martha Hawes before she had retired. And so I'm very fortunate and blessed, you know, to have this team with me. And as like I had said, this project is very unique, and I'm very thankful that my advisor, when she was first advising me, was Dr. G. McLean, was that she allowed me to take what I was thinking and put it onto paper and to, you know, go with it. And like I had mentioned earlier, I started this project from the ground up. I started with $0, literally $0. And I ended up getting funded through different avenues. I got funded through the Native Nations Institute. I got funded through MIT Solve, and I just recently got funded through the COBOL Summer Research Fellowship. And I'm also working on a third party funding who's going to be supporting this work in implementing solution-based strategies for other Indigenous communities rather than just focusing on the science. So in saying that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I'll be very open to answering any questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Richelle. That was wonderful to hear. So we have a couple of minutes or for one or two questions if anybody would like to pose any questions. Feel free to either unmute yourself or if you want to post something in the chat box. But I really do commend you for this groundbreaking research and the fact that you are tying it directly to your tribal community and finding ways to make improvements, and more importantly that you're getting guidance from the Hakatlis, and I think that's going to be very important, as they know that they always encourage, I know like grandparents and the elders always encourage the younger generation to go out and do work that will come back and impact their community. So thank you for this wonderful research that you're doing.
Thank you.
Okay, well, so we can move on with our, if that's okay, we can, any question? Oh, question?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was trying to be polite and raise my hand on the screen.
Sorry.
Thank you, Richelle. That was wonderful to hear. I wondered, I have a project that has some similarity where I have a student who's going to look at heavy metals in hemp. And I wondered if you had thought about whether you were going to do any kind of enrichment experiments in the greenhouse. With uranium, I could see that'd be challenging, but maybe with some of the other heavy metals, or were you primarily going to look at the samples that you collected in the field?
So we're looking right now because, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of the plants are like in sacred site areas. And so what happened over the years, I was age of 7, is these areas really became like, I would want to say they became extinct. People picked too much of these plants, and so they became non-existent. And a lot of that has become a result of different companies in border towns who are selling our medicine to not just Native communities, but to people who don't even use it for cultural purposes. And so that became a big problem, and that has been a persistent problem. And so to be very careful with the research that I'm doing, I plan on growing the plants in a greenhouse study, not picking them directly from the communities, because the plants should be utilized for traditional practices by the different Hakatlis throughout Navajo Nation. And so I am planning on doing a lot of different studies, spiking the soil, growing them. And, it's just really interesting because it does expose a lot of the different practices that happen to Indigenous people, not just through mining, but also through acculturation and, exploitation of not just natural resources, but also exploitation of our cultural and our identity as Native people through the use of our medicines. And so that's really where I also take my stance on this project, is looking at it in that context as well.
Thank you.
And I had a question too, Richelle. I mean, have you run into any type of resistance from, non-natives who are wanting to, they find these plants that we know as that come from our homeland, and they want to use it or keep it and catalog it within their own departments. But then I was just curious if there was any clash of cultures in that respect.
Well, I can't think of one more from the academic setting, but I do know, like I had mentioned, I know with like businesses, they do catalog a lot of that. And one of the things that I came about, I can't remember how long ago, I must have been doing my master's degree because I was on Flagstaff at the time, was a business that had, and that's how I came about it, was this business had all this medicine on like walls. And I was looking at it and I kept thinking, that looks so familiar. Like when I looked at the jars, and it had the location of where I used to go with my grandpa. And if you go to those places now, you wouldn't be able to find any. I do come into that issue where people try to, I guess, get a lot of the information from you in a different way, asking you very, specific questions. I had to be very careful, even in the academic setting, not disclosing too much that would compromise the cultural integrity of the different Hatathlis. And I'm very appreciative of them, acknowledging the work. And, I do plan, I have started with them from step 1, and I plan on ending with them at the last step, because this is going to impact them. And I want them to be able to make those informed decisions of what's best for them. And also for them to be very scientifically inclined to understand exactly what I was doing, rather than presenting at the end and being like, this is the number, and they don't understand what happened for like 3 years and it just doesn't make sense. So I want them to be very much educated as I am, as well at the end, and it'll be their project. I'm just kind of here doing it for them.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you. I agree with that. And the fact that, for many Native people, the plants that you bring out to use as part of your research, and just being good land stewards, you want to make sure you take that plant back and put it back in where it belongs. And I know that we've had a couple of researchers who would go out and they would seek certain plants, but they would also make an offering, and just, as they take the plant and then they bring it to wherever institution they're at, and they take that plant back and return it to back where it's coming from. I think that's very important.
And that's how I do my work. And like I had mentioned, I'm not only educated in the scientific herbalist aspect, I'm also trained as an indigenous herbalist for my tribe too. And so that's where I kind of get that personal connection to it as well.
Okay.
And I think Jane has her hand raised.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, do we have time for another question?
Yeah, sure. We have a time for one more question.
Okay. Hi, Richelle. This is Jane Mangold. I'm from Montana State University, and your project is amazing. Great job. It's really cool work. I was wondering if different medicinal plants are contaminated with, uranium or arsenic, do those heavy metals pose different risks depending on how the medicinal plant is used? For example, if it's consumed versus burned versus made into a tincture.
Yeah, and I wasn't able to share everything because of time, but that is a big concern. And just because of the different uses that you had mentioned of the different medicinal plants, some are used a lot for like smoking, if you will, like they're using different forms of like tobacco, and so that poses them like a pulmonary risk. And then we also have the risk of drinking these plants in a water-based solution, and then you think about the chemistry of arsenic and uranium, that could potentially pose a renal risk. And you also have to think too, like I had mentioned, my grandpa, he was trained when he was like 6 years old, and when he passed around mid-80s, he was exposed probably for 80 years to who knows what. And that was every day of his life, 7 days a week, and maybe multiple times a day. And it takes it to that personal level of looking at the human connection to the environment, and how we should really be looking at that, as well as the human health impacts to different indigenous peoples. And so, I have my hypotheses on the plants that I have right now. I don't want to say too much because I'd rather have a concrete number and then share it with the Diné Hatathli to talk through it before I share it with like the scientific community as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Richelle, for that wonderful presentation. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and we're pleased to have Audrey Harvey, who is our second speaker. Audrey is joining us as an SIGP alumni. She received her master's at Montana State University. She is currently a PhD student in biological sciences at Northern Arizona University. And additionally, she had received her BA and her BS from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. So I'm going to go ahead and officially turn it over to you, Audrey.
Thanks, Felica. Let me make sure I know what I'm doing with PowerPoint here. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, there it is. Can you guys see the full PowerPoint view? Okay, there we go. Great. Okay, cool. Yate she Audrey inishia nonish eja touching inishlant sotsoni bashishin twitini dashe toheglini dashinale. Hey everyone, my name is Audrey. As mentioned, I'm an SIGP alumna at Montana State University and now a first-year PhD student at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I'm really glad Richelle went first because she really set me up for the things that I will be talking about in my research and just the background that has gotten me to this point. So I'll be sharing with you an overview of my career, and that will lead into my current research. So I received my bachelor degrees from Fort Lewis College, and it took me a little longer to receive my biology degree because at the time I was working full-time for the Southern Ute Tribes Water Quality Program, and I'll get more into that in a minute. And in 2019, I graduated from Montana State University, where my advisor was Dr. Jane Mangle, who is also on this call. So thanks for coming. And now I am wrapping up my first year as a PhD student at Northern Arizona University, where my current advisor is Dr. Karen Havensack. So I grew up in a small community called Salina Springs, Arizona, in an area located in what I like to call the heart of the Navajo Nation, because we are pretty central to the layout of the Navajo Reservation. So this photo overlooks the small valley where at least 7 generations of my mom's family and clan has lived, and it's down in this valley where you see this tall spire.
Excuse me, Audrey, we can't see the second slide. We're still on the first slide that you have up there.
Oh, that's strange because I can see my slides just fine. Did that work?
We're still stuck on the first slide where you have improving restoration success on the Colorado Plateau.
No. Okay, sharing is paused. Okay, now do you see?
There you go. We can see it now.
Okay, great. I don't know what happened there. Okay, we're gonna keep going. So I grew up here. This is the photo that I just mentioned that overlooks the community that I grew up in, and my parents still live there today. And since I was a kid, I have always enjoyed watching the seasons change by observing what is growing all around us. And similar to Richelle's story, my family too has used plants throughout, our lifestyles, whether it's medicinally or for my grandma. She was a rug weaver and would dye her own wool. My mother as well. And observing plants in the community that I grew up in is still something that I enjoy today. And this photo is of my niece who we had a good time in quarantine lockdown this past year by just going out and exploring what was going on the ground. And so here she is picking some phloxes. So what solidified my journey in the sciences was my early career working for the Southern Ute Tribes Water Quality Program. And as a water quality technician, I was in charge of monitoring and assessing surface waters across the reservation. But it wasn't until a rather well-known catastrophe that I realized I was lacking in skills that limited my contributions to the program. And so after the Gold King mine spill, which this photo is famously made the internet waves for, there was a significant amount of water quality data that was coming into our program, and it was really frustrating in my position to not be able to do more for tribal members and to answer their questions relating to this environmental disaster. So at that time, I'd found a really great master's program at Montana State University where I was working in the Extension Office for Invasive Species. And what drew me to the program initially was that as the Extension Office, our work was guided by ranchers, farmers, and land managers across Montana. And it was also my opportunity to work with plants in the restoration field. So the bottom right is a photo of me and my former lab mates and Jane. And in the top right is the species of interest that I had worked on in my master's program. And it was, it's called Ventinata dubia. It's an invasive annual grass that was relatively new to invade Montana in the last decade. And here's a big infestation of it in at the base of the Berkshire Mountains in Bozeman, Montana. And actually, when I began my program, we had known of it infesting 7 counties in Montana, but by the time that I was done, about 3 years later, we had known of it and growing in 18 counties. So annual grasses are particularly pesky because they outcompete native perennial species because they have a fall dormancy, and at the earliest opportune time, they'll come up in the spring, and generally that is before any perennial species will establish or germinate. So the framework for addressing Ventinata infestations as well as other weeds is to use integrated weed management strategies. And so IWM takes what is known about the biology and ecology of a particular problem species and incorporates these different strategies to manage it where these infestations occur. And so foremost, prevention is key, just getting the public educated about what an invasive species is. And to promote healthy plant communities, physical controls include, I'm sure everyone has done this, is weed their gardens by hand pulling any pesky species there. Biological controls take a naturally occurring enemy of the problem species and will release it into where infested areas are to manage it. Chemical controls are pretty straightforward. They're the use of herbicides. And then finally, cultural controls are a little harder to wrap your head around, but essentially these are controls used that really try to promote what you want to see growing there as opposed to the problem species. And this includes a variety of like revegetation, using specific cultivars of seeds, seeding rates, as well as seeding times. And so for my master's work, I had conducted 3 independent studies related to Ventinata, in which in one I was doing a a herbicide efficacy trial where I was looking at how well this new herbicide worked on Ventinata as well as how it affected non-target species. In another study, I was looking at just the general biology and ecology of Ventinata, where I was growing Ventinata in a growth chamber in both current and elevated climate conditions. And then the third study was a seeding date study where I was looking at how seeding date might affect the establishment of a perennial grass. So my master's work in lab were really foundational for where I am now at NAU. My research now is in the realm of native plants materials development, and I am currently supported by the American Indian Graduate Center, NAU's Presidential Fellowship, and ECOS, which is the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society, which is also affiliated with my biology department. So to get oriented with my current project, let me take you here to the Colorado Plateau. The Colorado Plateau is an expansive region that covers about 340,000 kilometers square. It is thought to have the 3rd highest number of endemic species to North America, and endemic species are species that grow only in this region. And as you can see from the photo or the map I have on the left side, there are many different managers across this region, including federal, state, and tribal managers. And the people managing this land manage it for a wide range of uses, including natural resource extraction, livestock grazing, as well as recreation. And over the last decade or so, there's been an increase by all management to do restoration work because of these land legacy issues that Richelle so greatly described in her presentation, as well as restoration activity related to increased development in the West, and then just planning for climate change in general. Because of this increase in restoration activity, there is a significant need for local and pre-adapted plant material to use in these restoration efforts. But wild seed collection is very resource intensive in time and labor, as well as money. And of course, like Richelle mentioned as well, you know, a lot of these plants here, at least for Indigenous communities, you know, we don't typically want to share where they are because of you know, potential businesses that might take advantage of it. And so there's a limited supply that does not match the availability of wild seeds that are available in restoration. And another problem is that these current sources are not typically local. And this is a photo I took a few years ago at the Bruce Seed Farm in Montana. And actually, and Jane can correct me if I'm wrong here, but they actually supply grass seeds for a company out of Dolores. So those seeds that are grown in Montana are likely not pre-adapted to an area like the Colorado Plateau and the hot and dry climate that is here. And so with any seed production system, the process begins by collecting wild seed. And because producers are taking a small population of a much larger natural population, there's the potential of potential reduction in genetic variation of these native seeds. And in agricultural systems, which seed producers mimic, we often see a reduction in fitness that can cause both intentional and unintentional evolutionary selection in these production to restoration systems. And another issue is there are more grasses and forbs in production, and simply because grasses are much easier to grow in mass quantities than forbs. So two ways that try to overcome these issues is selecting seeds that are strictly sourced local, but as I mentioned, that is limiting and is because it's very resource intensive. The second way is that to overcome these issues is to utilize seed transfer zones. However, seed transfer zones are based on modeling and really lack the on-the-ground assessment of these genetic variations that could exist within this region. So currently, common garden experiments are underway at multiple sites to determine the local adaptation and fitness of 10 native forb species. And if you're not familiar with common gardens, basically what happens is a collection of wild seeds are taken from across the region, and in this figure, it's across an elevational region. And those seeds are then grown in a common garden where they experience the same environment. And then from that, you can determine differences in their functional traits. And so these common garden experiments that are currently going on are sort of the foundational piece that is leading into what I am doing right now, in that I am taking a subset of these 10 species and hoping to better understand how we can utilize them in restoration. In a restoration seed production system. So to dive a little deeper into my research, we also need an understanding of maternal effects. And maternal effects are the genotype and phenotype of an organism determined by its environment and the genotype and environment of its mother. And so we know that maternal environment influences progeny size, and progeny size, seed size, has implications for how well that seed will do in terms of germination, in terms of size, in terms of how much seed is output in the end. We know that literature exists. However, what we don't know is how well the environment is affecting forb species as opposed to grasses, which I had mentioned earlier are the primary species of interest in these systems. And we also just don't know, like we simply don't know how the maternal environment will influence the growth of a plant. And my research will take the maternal effects concept as well as information that we had gotten from these common garden experiments to then apply it to a seed production system to ask if we can manipulate the maternal environment of a native forb seed and still see the locally adapted advantages. So I have 3 research questions in mind for this study. The first question is, does the manipulation of the maternal environment result in changes in seed production? And we're looking at this in terms of seed quality and seed quantity. So what we expect is that water additions will have a greater effect in warmer locations, and nutrient additions will have stronger effects in nutrient limited locations. The second question is whether these maternal effects differ across spore species. And then the third question is, for each of the species that I'm looking at, is the expression of maternal effects dependent on the degree of local adaptation? And for all of these questions, we simply just don't know. So there are 5 species of interest that I'm looking at, and each of these 5 species come from 4 different population sources that range from an elevation of low to high. And they were collected back in 2018, and I wasn't obviously a part of this collection because I wasn't here at that time, but they were sourced in the Colorado Plateau areas. What I'm doing now is growing these plants in the NAU greenhouse under the same maternal environment. And so this is a photo of what that looks like. Come next month, I will outplant all of these plugs at 2 seed production experimental fields, one just outside Moab, Utah, and the other at Farmington, New Mexico on the Nappy fields, if you're familiar with the area. And then throughout the summer, we'll be implementing our treatments. Our treatments are a high water, low water treatment, as well as a fertilization application treatment. In the fall, come winter, we'll harvest our seeds and then grow those seeds again in the NAU greenhouse to determine those responses. So my species of interest are listed here: Gaillardia, Linum, Dipteria, Aragonum, and Argemini. Each of these has their own particular plant-related growth, and the biggest thing that the biggest challenge that I've been facing these last few months really is just getting 2 of these species to grow sufficiently for our experimental design. The first 3 were fairly easy to grow. We just put the seeds in the plug and added water and they sprouted. The 4th species that I have listed here needed to be cold stratified, so I put those in a cold, moist refrigerator for about 7 weeks before they started germinating, and then was able to put them in the plugs, and then they've now gone to seedling stage. The last species here is particularly hard to work with. This species is considered a successional species, meaning that it needs some fire-related seed germination or fire-related treatment to get the seeds to germinate. And what I've been doing just about daily for the last 2 months even is just going in and spraying it with liquid smoke, and that's just liquid smoke you'd find at the grocery store. So currently I have just over 4,800 plugs, and again, these will be split over 2 sites. So I'm using a split plot design where on one side we've got high water, one side we've got low water, and then that's split again by the application of fertilizer and then no fertilizer. And in each of these treatment quadrats, there are 20 plots where each of my different species will be randomly assigned. And those plots are surrounded by a ½ meter buffer, and keeping in mind here that we are trying to mimic a seed production system. And so this is kind of the goal of that design. Here's a photo from a few weeks ago. I was out visiting my sites. Currently, I am just getting logistics figured out for this field, this experimental field at these 2 sites. We've got weeds to deal with, and so that's been a lot of what the discussions have been for me this week, is just how to deal with the weeds in this system. Another piece is that irrigation system and getting the layout just right. So this also is a placeholder for what is to come for my PhD program. So I'd like to take you back to the first part of my talk where I explained that the Colorado Plateau has many different land managers, and 23% of this region is managed by tribal nations, and that the bulk of that being the Navajo Nation, which covers about 71,000 kilometers square. And just like the rest of the Colorado Plateau, the Navajo Nation is particularly unique in that it has arid deserts to montane forests. And in this region alone, the reservation alone, there are over thousands of plant species, and many of them are endemic to this region and have particular uses by the Navajo people medicinally and, you know, just used throughout their daily lives. And so reservations specifically have a unique history of land legacy uses. And so there's a big need for restoration material in this unique environment. And so the other piece that I'd like to show here too is just that this region, this unique environment has been in an extreme to exceptional drought for the last decade even. And so it makes it harder for plants to grow, plants to go to seed, and plants to be regenerating year after year. And so that too is why it's important to start thinking about how we can reestablish these native perennial systems. So I'd like to incorporate a continuation of the maternal effects project that I'm currently doing on Navajo land, and I actually recently spoke with the Navajo Native Plants program to conduct such trials. And they too are interested in the movement of restoration material across this landscape and ask if species are easily transferable for their restoration purposes. And that's specifically related to rangeland because they deal a lot with livestock foraging. I'm also curious about the timing of planting in this region, as it's typically recommended to plant seeds during the monsoons. However, the lack of rainfall, both seasonally and in the long term, might change when seeds need to be put on the ground. And finally, I am also interested in plant soil feedbacks that could exist within these mostly sandy regions across the Navajo Nation, and ask if there are unique feedbacks that can benefit restoration in this area. And so finally, thank you all for coming this evening and listening to my talk. I've just got some acknowledgements here of people who've helped me along the way to reach this point in my PhD career. It's definitely been an interesting first year, just with it being the pandemic, but also just getting started and getting going with where I'd like to be in the next few years. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. That was a wonderful presentation. And I guess if you can, round of applause, snaps. We do have time if you want to, if anybody has a question for Audrey, we can go ahead and take that question.
I have a question. This is Jane again. Thank you, Audrey. It was great to learn more about what you're up to these days. Are you considering climate change in any of your PhD research and how that might influence, you know, seed materials and time of planting, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, definitely considering it. And actually, we've been going through a bunch of like lab defenses this week, and I just sat in one of our lab defenses today, which talked about that specifically, because from those common garden experiments, they were really trying to tease apart how far you can take a seed so that it retains those locally adapted traits, basically. So what was sort of figured out, or one of the big highlights for me, at least from that study, was just that plant height is highly associated with hot and dry climates, I think is what it was. But yeah, there are a lot of different like climate variables we'll be teasing apart in this project as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I do want to just put up one more slide here. I'm going to come back to this slide regarding our Sloan programs, just so, again, people are aware of all the different, our partners across our Sloan programs. And of course, I can't pull it up at this time. So let me try one more time and, oops, cancel. Okay, well, I'm not able to pull it up, so we'll just get ready to tie up our program here. But I do want to, again, thank everybody for joining us here. I'm going to do my official closing so we can end our recording. And if there are any questions, you're welcome to, we can definitely either put them in the chat box here, or if Richelle and Audrey don't mind putting their email addresses in the chat box, and that way we can get those questions answered. So to officially close out this program for the evening, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to having future programs and seeing you back again with us. Thank you and have a good evening.